Welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at midday on Tuesday, March 5th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is provoking and waging around the world, and the racism we display against those we're killing, in accord with the Latin proverb, proprium humanae ingeni est odissi cum laesaris. It's human nature to hate those you have injured. International polls show that it's the United States that is by far the most feared government in the world, not Russia, China, Iran, or Israel. The wars the U.S. is raging in eight countries, and its war provocations against Russia and China risk a wider, even a nuclear war. Since 1945, the United States has killed between 20 and 30 million people in wars in Korea, Vietnam, the Mideast, Latin America, and elsewhere, designed to maintain the worldwide economic dominance that the U.S. inherited at the end of World War II. It's unfortunately the basis of U.S. foreign policy to use war and the threats of war to retard the economic development of Russia and China as competitors to American control of the world economy. From U.S. support for a fascist coup in Ukraine to U.S. naval provocations in the South China Sea and huge NATO military exercises in Eastern Europe. The rest of the world recognizes that the U.S. government is what Martin Luther King called it long ago, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. With other peace groups around the world, we call upon our government to close all foreign military bases, bring all U.S. troops and weapons home, and provide social supports, including free medical care, education, and a universal basic income for Americans who've been made poorer by generations of our government's war. Our guests today are Karen Aram, Sherry Daly, and David Green, and we will begin with Karen.
Okay, well, Carl, I was going to talk about Alfred McCoy, whom I've always respected since he wrote had his book published in the 70s, The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, which, although he didn't accuse the CIA, he certainly presented enough evidence proving how involved they were in that. And as I lived in Asia during much of the time, read the book, and I knew other people who had read it and were in agreement that it was certainly appeared accurate. And he really did have to oppose the CIA because they actually tried to get him kicked out of grad school, from what I understand. Yeah, I mean, I've seen him interviewed. Yeah, no, they really, he went through a lot to get that done. And he's written a couple other books since then. One I actually have. I brought it here just today. In the Shadows of the American Century. And he talks about U.S. militarization and the weaponry, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I had noticed some time ago that he is not, let's just say, he's not that positive about China. And I sort of attribute it to his spending a lot of time in the Philippines on one of the books that he wrote. And having lived overseas in Southeast Asia, I find that a lot of expats, they come away somewhat negative about China simply because most of these nations live in fear of the giant China, and because so many Chinese are doing business and commerce and literally control business and commerce throughout that region. But there are specific reasons for this, and it's because these are overseas Chinese, all right? Many of them have intermarried, specifically in Thailand, where they are safe, unlike in Indonesia, where they didn't have the intermarriage opportunities. And as we know, in 1965, 500,000 of them were killed at U.S. bidding, and by the Indonesians killing their own people. Primarily focused on Chinese communists, but we know how that is. There may have been, a couple hundred communists, and so they killed 500,000 people. And how many of them were actually Chinese, Indonesian, I don't know. But now I'm digressing. Okay, the point is, I read an article yesterday on the Facebook page of a friend, and it's I have to admit, it's a beautifully written historical account of what's known as empire and the world order, and the details that he presents. So it's worth reading, but at the same time, I was angry with his final analysis. And I'm going to just read now my response to the guy on Facebook who will probably never talked to me again. I think he didn't unfriend me, but an American whose leanings are very Democrat Party.
Don't worry, this program costs us a lot of friends, so it's...
Oh, I'm used to losing friends. Anyway, so what I said was McCoy's courage as a young man in revolting against the CIA by publishing his book, The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, has eroded in old age. Or perhaps his time in the Philippines has colored his vision, which I've already explained. There is so much U.S. propaganda in this article, beginning with his assertion that the World Bank and IMF pulled people out of poverty. His assumption that NATO imploding would be a bad thing. His assertions that China is the hegemon in the South China Sea, ignoring the U.S. armed battleships as of 2012 during Obama's pivot to Asia. He fails to point out the obvious that the International Court, when condemning China, was a U.S. action with U.S. lawyers representing the Philippines, even though the U.S. is not a member of the International Criminal Court, and the Philippines never used the island. Most of the islands in that region belonged to China at one time and were given to Japan and other nations by the U.S. after World War II. He never mentions the U.S. has between 800 and 1,000 military bases outside of the U.S., with most surrounding China. He never mentions China has only one military base outside of China. And most egregious is his assertion that the U.S. has brought peace and prosperity to the world, never mentioning the death and destruction committed by the U.S. government, killing millions while waging 8 wars in 17 years. China has invaded one nation in 40 years, Vietnam, and that was when they invaded Cambodia, and there's history to that. Now, he fails to mention the BRI, or Silk Road as it's known, having more than one purpose, because the first and the number one purpose that I saw was that it provides a route of transportation in addition to the shipping lanes by sea through the Malacca Straits, which is necessary to traverse for any shipping in that part of the world. And those straits, if closed off by U.S. proxies such as Indonesia, our ally, and Malaysia, I'm not sure where they stand at this point in time. I have some views on that. But bottom line, if they cut off the Malacca Straits without the BRI, then I'm sure that would result in war. You just don't, because it would be killing their opportunities for the Chinese to bring back much needed oil for manufacturing. So much of what China does is defensive, and Mr. McCoy knows that very well, as he is very well aware of U.S. military buildup of arsenals today. So I was really angry about his article, because I felt that, now, again, he does it in such a way that, let's put it this way, it's all rather subjective. It's like the way propaganda is presented, it's cloaked. It's cloaked. And I guess I see it because, well, I actually wasn't looking for it, but I saw it. And I guess my only point on this is that even though, like I said, I may have overreacted because it has a lot to offer in the article, I think that he's very concerned about war. He's very concerned. He's very anti-empire. But I think when he paints fear of China, he's creating the reason for war with China. And this is one of the things I find so offensive, is that we should not be fearing China, and if they hadn't been put on the defensive, they would not be building all that they are building now, and including, even a couple of years ago, Carl, I think I was here and we talked about the fact that China did not have a first strike capability related to nuclear weapons. Only the U.S. and Russia had first strike capability. But after all of the provocations against China by the U.S. in the South China Sea specifically, China did remove, there's something that they have to remove from the weapons in order to have first strike capability. So this is the kind of thing I think that people need to understand. And it's not because I'm a pacifist specifically, but it's because I do believe that when you continue to provoke, and I'll use Venezuela as an example. In Venezuela, we are provoking them with what? Aid after sanctions that are crippling them, and trying to send in what I call a Trojan horse. It's supposed to be aid, but it's actually probably weapons. And we know we've got Colombia, our ally, standing by, and Colombia is one of the more violent nations in the region, where Venezuela is receiving aid from Cuba, from Russia, from China, the food and the products that they actually need, the medicines that they need. So that's the kind, he accuses China of working with nations that have bad records related to human rights. And I keep thinking, wait a minute, none of the nations that China never intervenes in other people's issues or problems. But here we are, the U.S., who are we working with? The Saudis, the Israelis, and UK and France. And I'm Irish, and I know that my ancestry was colonized. So, sorry, I came here to rant, and now I'm done.
Thank you, Karen. You're watching Aware on the Air, presented by the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana. We're discussing first today the article by Alfred McCoy, a longtime geopolitical writer. McCoy's article in The Current Nation is entitled "The End of Our World Order is Imminent." And in it, he takes a somewhat surprising position on the geopolitical situation, more sympathetic perhaps to the American government than we'd expect from McCoy's background. As Karen pointed out, he was an instrumental figure in revealing the crimes of the United States in Southeast Asia, notably in his 1970s book, The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, about what the American war had brought in terms of drug traffic throughout the world. McCoy is an interesting guy. He's a professor of history at Wisconsin, and I think what surprises us most about this article is how sympathetic he seems to be to the position of the United States.
Did you get the sense that there was a gun at his head when he wrote
No,
this article?
no,
I did
no,
at first, but no.
I think he'd been reading too much Mackinder. I think that he sees himself as a geopolitical analyst in the tradition of Admiral Mann and the tradition from a century ago about the nature of empires and world orders, and he sees it from this somewhat Olympian perspective that shocks us a bit when he talks about the present situation without much condemnation of what seems to be crimes by the American government. I was reminded of Noam Chomsky's quoting recently a remark from Thucydides, the Peloponnesian War. Chomsky pointed out that contemporary world politics illustrates the Athenians' reaction to the citizens of Milos during that war. Quote, "The powerful do what they wish, and the weak suffer what they must." Now, you can call that Olympian if you want, but I mean, while we condemn what the powerful, in this case the United States, does, it is possible at least to understand a perspective that says, look at this in the longer term. Certainly they're crimes always, but we should also understand what the mechanics of the international situation is. Did you get that sense, David? Is that your notion? This article, by the way, the article we're talking about appeared in The Nation, and I will put it on the...
It's on Counterpunch as well as just Facebook.
Yes,
of course.
Oh, okay.
And I'll put it. I'll link to it on the Aware website, Aware Facebook page.
Yeah, the question becomes partly how much criticism, what is the appropriateness of American citizens criticizing China in relation to our own government. There's no doubt that China is a capitalist country. David Harvey, among other people, analyzed this. He has done that recently on his podcast.
And his was excellent, yes.
Yeah. And that China is operating by the laws of capital as they are playing themselves out on this global scale for the past 40 years, and that the United States is threatened by that. Another complicating factor here, according to a good friend of Carl and mine named Louis Project, is that
Louis.
Yeah, is that
He's
Louis,
not a good friend.
is that he's concerned about the fate of the Uyghurs in China, and that
Right,
a
that's
million
the
of them are allegedly being held in concentration camps or being confined in some way, and that this is a part of a larger argument that's critical of those on the left who they feel this, and this includes, of course, the ISO, the International Socialists, who feel that we need to have more balance in criticism of all global imperialist capitalist governments, which basically, and they're basically talking about Russia, China, Iran, and those that they feel are being given a pass, especially in relation, say, to Syria, by the people like perhaps those at this table who they refer to as the anti-imperialist left, meaning those who were more critical of U.S. intervention in Syria and less critical of the manner in which Syria was being aided by Russia, Iran, and so forth. So that may be getting a little too much into the weeds of it, but that kind of lays it out.
It's an important point.
Yeah.
I think it does lay it out, and it suggests that our concern with contemporary actions by our government, which AWARE as an organization was founded to protest a generation ago, shouldn't be subsumed into this sort of geopolitical vision, which is what McCoy seems to have done quite remarkably.
But not as nakedly as some of the ISO people who were.
Right.
I mean, McCoy wasn't being nasty to anyone on the so-called anti-imperialist left, but he was putting forward with this idea that we should fear China.
And the information is important. I mean, he puts it in the context of not only recent history, but long-term history of the rise of empires and world orders, and it's certainly worthwhile to think about that. He actually has elsewhere an article that is remarkably detailed on the life stories of the major thinkers of geopolitics who invented the enterprise a century or so ago, most notably Mackinder and also Mann.
Yeah.
And he points out how much, interesting to look at this, how much their world visions were formed by the vicissitudes of their particular lives, academic and military. And it's almost funny, in a sad sort of way, to see the vast thought castles developed by these guys who got thrown out of the actual castles they lived in. Interesting.
Yeah. I think you both raised excellent points, and well, as I said, I would have preferred if McCoy had been a little more up to date or recent in his discussion related to history, meaning what we've been doing since we colonized Africa. He just sort of dismisses it. Somewhere I wrote it all down that I was going to actually say, and I can't find it. But anyway, he actually says, but now, the African colonies gained their independence and, everything's fine. Well, I'm reading about Algiers right now, okay? And my head's been in Algiers for the past couple days, and I'm thinking, no, everything isn't just fine, and the fact is the colonization of these nations. I've also been watching an Irish Rebellion series on TV, on Netflix. It's not that good, but it covers the death and destruction that people have to go through in order to ward off colonialism and what we are seeing coming back. And as you both know, I've spoken frequently about the militarization that U.S. is doing now with AFRICOM on all 54 nations of the African continent. And we won't get into that, but I'll rest my case.
I'm tempted to put in another plug here for the book that I think is most important in reflecting on the last century of American world politics. That's Nicholson Baker's Human Smoke. The subtitle of the book is The Beginning of World War II and the End of Civilization. I recommend the book highly, and I've done it here before for reasons that suggest that it's a way of looking at recent political history that produces the situation we find ourselves in, that is absent that peculiar special pleading for the virtues of the United States that seems to inhabit all usual accounts of that, and to our surprise also seems to inhabit McCoy's account. So I could recommend that on the same. If you're going to read McCoy, and there's certainly no harm in doing that, read Nicholson Baker too.
I have the book as a result of your recommendation, but I have yet to read it, so.
One more comment I wanted to make about McCoy's article, in terms of, there was kind of an odd reference to people being pulled out of poverty, or people being brought out of poverty, according to, I think he referred to World Bank data.
Right.
And there's been a debate about that. A fellow named Jason Hickel, that I've referred to on our other program. And basically it seems like McCoy sort of got it backwards, that
He does.
China, all those hundreds of millions of people who've been genuinely pulled out of poverty have been mostly in China. Whereas the data that shows that other people in other regions have in any significant way been pulled out of poverty by globalization in the last 20, 30, 40 years is vastly overrated, because of the manner in which the dollar a day, the ridiculous sounding dollar a day standard of $2 or $3 or $5 just doesn't reflect, of course, people's lives, and that this World Bank, IMF data, whatever it is, just is basically lowered the bar enough of poverty to make it seem like hundreds of millions of people in other places besides China have been brought out of poverty, when in fact it's only in China, whatever the brutal nature of some of their industrialization policies, which David Harvey points out, in the manner in which people were drawn off the land into these dormitories to work in these factories, Foxconn and the whole thing. It's brutal, but it's brought people out of rural poverty into the capitalist, sort of barely above poverty framework.
Which is why I like David Harvey's analysis, but I want to point one more thing out, is that when McCoy, I think that's when I really blew my top, was when he referred to the IMF and the World Bank as bringing people out of poverty. Read John Perkins' economic memoir, Memoirs of an Economic Hitman, because it shows how that's not the goal. The goal is to actually enslave nations, which is precisely what we've done with many. In fact, China has gone into Africa, and not all of the nations, but many of the nations that were so indebted to the World Bank and the IMF, China has just given them interest-free loans completely, because they recognize that they're already in debt to those two organizations at the U.S. So it's really, that's what really blew my top, because I thought, boy, you're right, David, he really got it backwards on that. I'm sorry.
I think we may be missing a point that McCoy really concentrates on, in part because we're so young. What I mean is that McCoy's notion of the IMF, remember what the crucial event is in the IMF and the World Bank, pulling people out of poverty, as McAvoy says it. It's the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944. He's talking about the reconstruction after the Second World War, which the United States, as the only undamaged country, a major country emerging from that war, presided over. Now, there's something to be said for that. The period after 1945 is referred to by Thomas Piketty in his important book on capital in the 21st century as Les 30 Glorieuses, the glorious 30 years. Now, those 30 years were glorious, 45 to 75, and he has a certain Eurocentric focus, but he's talking about the world wrecked by the Second World War as a whole. That 30 years is glorious because it's the rebuilding from the destruction of the Second World War, the rebuilding of the war of the capitalist order that the United States presides over. That certainly did bring people out of poverty produced by the war itself, the vast destruction of that war. Now, there's nothing wrong with noticing that, but there is a sense in which it's yesterday's news. as you say, David, the more recent materials perhaps doesn't more recent material perhaps doesn't support his enthusiasm for the World Bank and the IMF as instruments of human betterment rather than instruments of American worldwide economic control.
Yeah. And in that light, the countries that are allowed by the United States to develop in a way that makes them creates this middle class, we have chosen those countries to be our allies in this global order. South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong to a certain extent in the manner in which that's complicated, of course, and those places that they did develop, but they're also bulwarks in the U.S. global order. And, obviously, Japan after World War II, redeveloped into a first world country.
And that throws a certain light on the notion of an American economic and political and even military decline, which is clearly going on in a relative sense.
Yeah.
As the rest of the world rebuilt from the Second World War, the vast control that the U.S. exercised in 1945 was necessarily going to decline. That generation is probably over. The American decline continues in a relative sense, even though we keep seeing the supposed hegemony of American capital exercised around the world. It's no accident, I think, that the left-right distinction in American politics, to the extent it ever existed, has been replaced by a conflict between corporate globalism and economic nationalism. You can call either one of them left or right as you prefer, but it was no accident that this distinction was at the center of the Trump campaign, because the Trump people, however consciously or unconsciously, decided that putting themselves at the head of an economic nationalist program, which was designed to improve the lot of the average American, against the 1%'s corporate globalism, was a way to win an election, and they did. We can talk about populism around the world as an example of this, but we have it here at home, even though we haven't quite recognized it in our political discussion. Instead, we've been subject to a Trump distraction syndrome, which misrepresents the various forces at work, I think.
Yeah, and Russiagate, which I see now as it disappears due to the lack of evidence. We've got Chinagate, and so that's why I'm especially defensive over Chinagate, because we know that's the ultimate goal, and the outcome of containment, which I think is the goal, just as we have contained Russia somewhat on their borders with NATO. The ultimate goal of containment with China will really spell disaster, total disaster. I don't see how we would not end up in a war if that happens.
You're watching Aware on the Air, presented by the members and friends of the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, and we are turning in the second half of our program to our guest, and I'll let Karen introduce guest and describe the problem.
Sherry Daly, she's been here before, and so I suggested she might want to come in and discuss her letter and article, which I think is very worthwhile, and I hope she can get it published after we're on the speak about it on the program. Sherry.
Hello. So I contacted my senators regarding the first piece of legislation proposed in the Senate this year, S1, the Strengthening America's Security in the Middle East Act of 2019. For specific reasons, I was opposed to this bill, and I contacted my senators. And here is the letter I received from Senator Duckworth, who did vote for S1. Durbin didn't seem to have any difficulties not voting for it. But so first I'll read the letter so that you can understand my rebuttal. Dear neighbor, thank you for contacting me to share your thoughts on S1, Strengthening America's Security in the Middle East Act of 2019. I appreciate you taking the time to make me aware of your concerns on this important matter. As your senator, I carefully consider all legislation that comes before the Senate for a vote. I must weigh the intent and effects of the full legislative package, as well as the merits of each component. S1 combined 4 individual measures that would independently address 1. Security aid to Israel, 2. Support for our Jordanian allies' fight against the Islamic State, 3. Sanctions against the Syrian financial system, and 4. State and local initiatives concerning BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Movement. I will not speak about the support for our Jordanian allies' fight against ISIS because I don't have enough knowledge to comment on that, although I seriously dispute that that's an authentic program. But regarding the other 3 is where I will speak. So Senator Duckworth continues. Some votes are inherently more difficult than others, and no legislation is perfect. While I strongly oppose the BDS movement, I have long had concerns about the way Combating BDS Act and similar legislation seeks to address the movement. Specifically, I am concerned that the bill as drafted could be interpreted to change long-standing U.S. policy toward Israeli settlement activity and the implication the bill has on domestic freedom of speech protections. The concerns regarding freedom of speech implications are rightly being litigated before federal courts and would be subject to further debate and amendment in the House of Representatives if that chamber even takes up the bill. This bill does not protect a state or local BDS law from being challenged in court by an individual on constitutional grounds. Ultimately, however, my concerns with the Combating BDS Act did not outweigh the remaining majority of this legislation, which represent important measures to concretely support our allies and address serious national security concerns. This legislation would preserve Obama administration international agreements that promote regional security through cooperation with our allies. It would also give the Trump administration more tools to levy sanctions against human rights abusers in the Assad regime in Syria. That is why I joined a bipartisan group of senators to pass this bill by a vote of 77 to 23 on February 5th. National security challenges facing our country will only grow in complexity and size in the coming years. Whether countering the threat of terrorism, combating the proliferation of nuclear weapons, or simply working together to respond to major global challenges, effective international cooperation is more important than ever in advancing our core security interests overseas to make Americans safer at home. Thank you again for contacting me.
I take it you weren't entirely convinced by this response.
So let's get through the rebuttal, and then maybe we can have a discussion. Oh my, so much to contend with in this brief letter that she sent.
Isn't it the truth?
All right, so my premise is that the senator displayed contempt for her oath to uphold the Constitution by voting for this bill, demonstrated a failure of responsibility and ethics, my son made me add that, in her role as a U.S. senator, and expressed duplicitous and hypocritical attitudes regarding human rights abuses around the globe. In regard to the 4 provisions, as I said earlier, I'm going to focus on 3. The first one I want to focus on is banning BDS, which violates our First Amendment rights. Number 2 is applying sanctions to Syria on the basis of human rights abuses, but not to Saudi Arabia or Israel, hypocritical. And 3, handing over billions of unnecessary dollars to the oppressive Israeli regime is unethical and demonstrates contempt for the use of taxpayers' dollars in the face of dire domestic issues across our country. Constitutionally speaking, the most concerning is banning the BDS movement. BDS, boycott, divest, sanctions. Senator Duckworth asserts her opposition to BDS movement, but nowhere explains why, contending that BDS needs to be addressed. Boycotts are protected under the First Amendment, so why would a constitutionally protected right need to be addressed? Does the senator have something against free speech? The First Amendment? The Constitution? How did a U.S. senator develop the notion that her job is to defy the Constitution? Absurdly, just the opposite is true. Her duty is to uphold the Constitution, as she has sworn to do, a requirement of every U.S. senator. The U.S. government's support for sanctions everywhere, but in Israel, is duplicitous. Duckworth's vote for S1 approves sanctions against Syria while simultaneously prohibits Americans' right to sanction Israel? You read right. This bill allows, quote, sanctions against the Syrian financial system to give the Trump administration more tools to levy sanctions against human rights abusers in the Assad regime in Syria, end quote, but denies sanctions against Israel. Duckworth states that the provision to sanction Syria is why she joined, quote, a bipartisan group of senators to pass this bill. Can hypocrisy be any more blatant than supporting sanctions in Syria while ignoring the more than 100 UN resolutions citing Israeli violations and human rights and international law against Palestinians? How can Duckworth justify sanctions against the Assad regime while voting for a bill that would punish Americans, American businesses, federal, state, and local governments for supporting sanctions against the Netanyahu regime? The Israeli regime has violated every democratic principle outlined in our Constitution in their treatment of Palestinians, including not just restrictions, but complete denials of the democratic freedoms Duckworth enjoys here in her own country, freedoms that she says she fought for in Iraq, including freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of the press, the right to vote, the right to due process. But more than this, the Israeli regime has also engaged in illegal activities, actions, such as usurping Palestinian lands and wells, demolishing homes, cultural centers, hospitals, and schools, and killing protesters, medical personnel, and journalists extrajudicially, all of which are violations of international law. Not to mention imprisoning 6,000 Palestinians without trial for political reasons. Almost 300 of them are children. These violations are not just considered illegal by the U.S. and the UN, but by the Israeli government's very own laws. For that matter, if our government wants to apply sanctions for human rights abusers, why is the U.S. government not applying sanctions against the Saudi Arabia regime for the ongoing war in Yemen, and the Saudi military violating international law by bombing hospitals and obstructing aid from reaching the Yemenis in a war that has been cited as the worst humanitarian disaster in the world? Who, besides me, would like to know why two of these governments are not held to account with U.S. sanctions for the human rights abuses and violations of international laws, while a third is? In addition to supporting the unconstitutional banning of BDS, Duckworth also favors S1 because of the security aid proposed for Israel. With so many dire needs for Americans at home, why does Israel require so much security aid, $38 billion over the next 10 years, when they already outgun the Palestinians exponentially, not only with ground forces, but with air power, which the Palestinians do not have, as well as nuclear weapons, which the Palestinians do not have, and of which, for some reason, the Israeli regime is not required, like the Iranians, to undergo inspections or give any kind of transparent account of exactly what they do have. It's quite interesting. You can Google nuclear weapons, and you can see a chart. I forget, it's probably Wikipedia. You can see a chart that outlines all of the nations on this planet that have nuclear weapons, and more or less, I'm sure there are approximations of what they have, but for Israel, it's dashes all the way across.
Mm-hmm. But we know it's something like 200 to 400.
Now that the United States government has cut all aid to Palestine as of last autumn, leaving Palestinians completely unprotected against the destruction of the powerful US-backed Israeli regime? Why does Israel require any aid at all, much less an increase in aid, to combat a people virtually defenseless against such a well-endowed military, a defenselessness demonstrated repeatedly over decades now in successive Israeli offenses in which the numbers of Palestinians killed and homes destroyed are many, many, many times greater than Israelis killed or destruction to their property. Duckworth acknowledges she is concerned that the bill as drafted could be interpreted to change long-standing U.S. policy toward Israeli settlement activity. I have no idea what Duckworth thinks this policy is. I was hornswoggled by this statement because U.S. policy has always been to stand by, behind, over, and under Israel, no matter every injustice that has been committed against the Palestinians since the ill-informed British idea, backed by the UN, was developed into the partition plan of 1947 to take away land from one people and give it to another. Considering Duckworth's disdain for constitutionality, it is not surprising that she omits a telling word from her statement about Israeli settlement activity. That word is illegal. And let's not be deceived by the word activity, which is a sterilized euphemism for clause of demolition and forcible removal of Palestinians. The Palestinians have almost nothing left from the original draft of the 1948 map of the partition plan. The Israeli regime has stolen close to 90% of the original land designated for Palestine, which was more, or actually less, evenly divided among the two groups of people. Gaza, the most densely populated area in the world, a population of 51% children, and a large minority of elders, has been repeatedly besieged with inordinate amounts of firepower in an overwhelmingly civilian ghetto in which Gazans are trapped, unable to escape bullets and rockets. They are sitting ducks. The Israeli regime has constructed a wall in the West Bank that rises 25 feet into the air, more than twice the height of the Berlin Wall. This wall doesn't separate Palestinians from Jews, and they don't call it a security wall for that reason. It cuts through primarily Palestinian areas, weirdly zigzagging to separate Palestinians from their own neighbors and fragmenting Palestinian communities. Along this wall are checkpoints stopping Palestinians from their daily routines. In some cases, Palestinian workers must line up as early as 2 a.m. to get through these checkpoints just to get to work on time. In many cases, school children must walk miles out of their way to get to school because of these blockades. The Palestinians have been blamed repeatedly for not accepting one crap peace plan after another, offering them virtually nothing. Contrary to Duckworth's delusion that the United States government has been acting on the moral high ground regarding long-standing U.S. policy towards Israeli settlement activity, nothing could be further from the truth. The United States government has been the predominant and often the only obstacle blocking one UN security vote after another to remedy and sanction the transgressions of the Israeli regime. To date, since the 1967 Israeli land grab, the regime has constructed or assisted settlers in establishing more than 200 settlements in the West Bank, which now house almost 620,000 settlers. And settler violence is on the rise. This has been the long-standing U.S. policy toward Palestine, brilliantly encapsulated last year by illegally moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, with the crowning achievement of this moral high ground being cutting all aid to Palestine last fall, including money to address the humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip. Based on what is written in the February 7 letter I received, I can't help but imagine a photograph of the senator with a look of astonishment on her face the day she learns that the Israeli regime has finally stripped the Palestinians of every last plot of land, village, every home bulldozed, every well and grove of olive trees seized. Thousands of Palestinians languish in prison without due process because they dared to protest their lack of democratic freedoms, the stealth of their land, and the murder of their people. The U.S. government often refers to Israel, as has Duckworth in a letter to me last spring, as, quote, our only democratic ally in the Middle East. Israel may be an ally, but it is not a democratic one. They are our ally against Palestinians and against all Arabs living in the Middle East. This is and has remained the long-standing U.S. policy, Duckworth cites in the region. This is racism. Duckworth's mixed heritage does not give her a special pass from being held accountable for racist attitudes and actions against a group of people she is demonizing, just as the German regime in the 30s and 40s demonized another group of people. As evidence of this racist attitude, Duckworth's letter is so anti-Palestinian, it does not even mention the words Palestine or Palestinian once, even though the whole crux of the letter is a response to concerns about a Palestinian movement, BDS. Not only is BDS constitutional, but it is a nonviolent movement working to help people everywhere fight oppression against the Palestinians. I, for one, would like to hear Duckworth say the words Palestine, Palestinian. I would like her to stop her erasure and cultural genocide of the Palestinians. As if Duckworth's position on these S1 provisions were not flawed enough, her response contains a shameful, threefold abrogation of her responsibility as a U.S. Senator. First, she says restricting BDS is, quote, rightly being litigated before federal courts, end quote. In other words, she admits that she consciously voted for a bill that violates the Constitution. But we need not worry, because the courts can always fix it and strike it down. Duckworth took an oath to uphold the Constitution. The oath did not stipulate that members of Congress can violate the Constitution because the courts will fix everything in the end. This is a shameful abrogation of her responsibilities as a U.S. Senator and is an example of wasting the court's time reviewing a law she recognizes in advance as unconstitutional, log-jamming the courts with absurd litigation involving Americans' primary freedoms as outlined in our Bill of Rights. Second, she further abrogates her responsibilities as a U.S. Senator by passing the buck along to the House when she says that the bill will be subject to further debate and amendment. This shows that Duckworth thinks it is acceptable to waste our U.S. representatives' time and energy considering a bill that is unconstitutional. This bill should not be going anywhere while containing an unconstitutional provision already being litigated, and Duckworth neglects to add 1 in 2 states now. Third, she further abrogates her responsibilities as a senator by sloughing them off onto individuals to litigate constitutionality. I am having difficulty understanding what Duckworth conceives are her responsibilities as a U.S. Senator. It seems to me as she is saying it is everybody else's job to safeguard our Constitution. The courts, the House of Representatives, and us individual citizens. I put it to Duckworth that it is her responsibility to ensure that all bills for which she votes are constitutional. Her primary duty as a U.S. Senator is protecting the Constitution. Actions like her vote for this bill are creating more and more dysfunctionality in our government. But perhaps the most condemnatory aspect of Duckworth's vote for this bill, beyond violating our Constitution, which all in all represents and protects property and corporate interests above individual rights and liberty, is her complete lack of sincerity and ethics in casting a vote at all. She repeatedly states that no one needs to worry about this bill passing because the BDS provision is unconstitutional, that it will get stopped by the courts, or by further debate and amendment in the House, or by us, U.S. citizens. If Duckworth truly believes that her vote is doing nothing to further this bill, why then vote? For what purpose? Who stands to benefit from this show, this pretense? It makes one wonder, who is her audience to this vote? To whom is she kowtowing? Her vote not only demonstrates contempt for our Constitution, but framed by her own feeble justifications, it signifies wholly unethical behavior. How does Duckworth justify this violation of her oath and departure from ethics? Ever heard of national security? The catch-all that has allowed lawmakers to violate our Constitution over and over throughout our history. Wasn't it national security that justified Roosevelt locking up more than 100,000 Japanese Americans during World War II without just cause? Wasn't it national security that was used during McCarthyism to justify the House Un-American Activities Committee that destroyed thousands of American lives? Also, I might add, precisely by violating our constitutionally protected freedoms of speech, political activity, and press? Wasn't it national security that was used to justify an illegal war in Vietnam and the killing of 6 million people in Southeast Asia because the United States government did not like the forms of government other countries were establishing for themselves? Wasn't it national security that was used to justify the illegal U.S. invasion of Iraq on completely false grounds? Now the United States government is once again beating the drums of national security to squash Venezuela, a country that has never attacked us or done us any harm. Another country whose government, democratically established by Venezuelans, is not serving the corporate interests of the United States government. Just like Iraq, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Syria, Yemen. In fact, U.S. cities benefited from a poverty program offered by Venezuela to obtain oil at discounted prices. Just what doesn't national security allow us to do? Abuse asylum seekers on our southern border? Ban a whole group of people from entering our country because they are Muslim? Duckworth states, quote, ultimately, however, my concerns with the Combating BDS Act did not outweigh the remaining majority of this legislation, which represent important measures to concretely support our allies and address serious national security concerns. This is the same as saying that the Constitution can be sacrificed to pursue United States government hegemony, a philosophy that sanctifies picking and choosing allies, what countries to punish and reward, not on any legal or moral grounds, but on the basis of what we can take and who we can control. We punish Syria with sanctions for human rights abuses and reward Israel with $38 billion for the same human rights abuses. We punish Venezuela for human rights abuses, many of which are sanctions, were the result of our sanctions, while rewarding Saudi Arabia's human rights abuses with more arms and weapons deals. Fortunately, senators do not take an oath to support United States government hegemony, even though, like Duckworth, most of them act like that is their key job. And that focus on growing United States government power overseas is the main reason our country is failing its own citizens at home. Duckworth states that this legislation, quote, would preserve international agreements that promote regional security through cooperation with our allies, end quote. Our allies, our countries, we give billions of dollars to, period. If we gave billions of dollars to Iraq or Iran or Palestine or Syria, they too would be our allies. It would be quite educational to be provided an explanation by members of Congress regarding why the United States government chooses some countries as allies in the Middle East and demonizes others. As far as any of these international agreements promoting regional security, I put it to Duckworth to take another look at the Middle East. It is in a shambles, and the United States government and its coalitions becoming a more prevalent presence throughout the region and Africa are responsible for the overall destabilization. The deterioration of security grows worse the longer I live and has never been more dire in my entire lifetime than now. Duckworth says, quote, national security challenges facing our country will only grow in complexity and size in the coming years. Why is that? Is she measuring that in US dollars? Was there ever a time in US history when security issues did not grow in size and complexity? To me, this sounds like a justification for pouring more billions and trillions into the military, leaving our domestic issues to languish again, as usual, as the United States government has done for the past 40 years. And how has pouring more and more money into regional security panned out for the Middle East or for the safety of Americans at home? 2 words: Twin Towers. Perhaps Senator Duckworth has forgotten who was responsible for the destruction of our Twin Towers. Were these towers brought down by Iraq, Syria, Iran, Yemen, Palestine? I don't know what planet this lawmaker is living on, but it does not resemble mine. Thank you.
You've been listening to a powerful statement by Sherry Daly in response to a letter from our junior senator, Tammy Duckworth. If Senator Duckworth is willing to show her face anywhere after that, she has an invitation, of course, to come on here and comment on Sherry's response to her. You've been watching Aware on the Air, where we discuss the war-making of the United States and the activity of American officials that lead to that situation. Comments, ladies and gentlemen?
I hope that when Senator Duckworth does show her face somewhere, that there are some angry faces to show back at her, in spite of whatever political, Democratic Party function that might be, or whatever civil kind of nicey-nice thing that might be. That's some pretty serious stuff. Not that Durbin doesn't deserve the same,
yes,
for any number of reasons.
That's right.
But whatever.
No,
At least not on S1.
At least not on that
on
one.
this one.
Yeah. So, I guess you could say that their votes canceled out each other. Isn't the way that's supposed to work? I was going to comment, at least in a very minor way, that the last administration that opposed, that genuinely was upset by Israeli settlement expansion in the West Bank, was that of George H.W. Bush in the late 80s and 90s, and that led, of course, to much criticism from the Democratic Party side, which helped elect Clinton president in 1992.
Don't you can get Carl started.
Big buddy? Yes.
So we're giving credit to the Republican Party for
No, I'm just saying.
joking,
I'm just saying that's the way
but
it went
it's-
down.
yeah.
There was that minor period in where for perfectly geopolitical reasons,
Right.
they're just as crass as what you've been referring to, that the Republicans didn't see fit to genuinely support Israel's settlements, as opposed to just this sort of wink. Our government has always stated that Israeli settlement expansion was not helpful.
Yeah.
And it's never done anything to actually counteract that.
Also, George W. criticized the Israeli settlement
Yeah.
building, but he was stifled.
Yeah. Well, he was more surrounded by neocons, in a literal sense, than his father was.
Most of the time, foreign policy operates on autopilot, and the only difference that I have seen, based upon the history that both of you have taught me over the years, is strategy and tactics, and what we do now and what we wait till the next administration.
A couple of random thoughts to this powerful presentation we've just heard. The current movie Vice is far better than it ought to be. I saw it quite by accident. I hadn't planned to see it. It's a film biography of Dick Cheney, done by a group of people in Hollywood who are primarily actors and producers, and they're aware of their lack of credentials, perhaps, to talk about politics, and they've produced the most political film that we've seen in a while. And a year of interesting, under-the-radar political films. The front runner about the 1988 election being one that's close to my heart.
Yes, given your daughter produced it, yes.
But Vice is extremely good because it puts this point that David was just making in some political context and a quite condemnatory, appropriately so, approach to the presidency of Dick Cheney, if we can put it that way. I recommend it. The discussion of America's foreign policy crimes has trouble getting into the general consciousness, and occasionally it comes from peculiar places, including perhaps Hollywood. Another
Sometimes,
thing,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, but some
Another
of
thing,
Hollywood is unbearable, the way it projects war. I'm sorry.
Another thing that occurred to me in your discussion of the, in your response to Senator Duckworth on the BDS aspect of Senate Bill 1, what do you make, Sherry, of the threats by the president to issue an executive order withholding federal funds from universities that do not respect free speech?
More of the same, controlling.
Big pardon?
That's a way to control freedom of speech, unlimited.
But, David, you have a
Well,
sense of...
no, yeah. We've only got like a few seconds left, but yeah, yeah. I mean, that's the irony of what Trump is saying.
But-
if it were taken literally. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, to be clear, what Trump is saying here, it's exactly those people who are trying to shut up BDS on campus that are affected by the administration's suggestion that federal funds will be withheld from universities that go along with that. So, and at least on the face of it, it can be interpreted as a defense of free speech, as it says it is, the president's policy, over against the things that S1 are trying to do, and that Duckworth is defending here. So, you know.
Trump says a lot of things, Carl.
Well, it may, you know, well, the discussion isn't over. It should go on, and a BDS discussion shut down artificially
Right.
by universities or by states.
Yeah, aside from the
Yeah.
administration, the universities and colleges across this country are making their own policies about limiting students and professors' right to express
Exactly.
themselves. So,
And to some people's surprise, the present chief executive is on the other side of that argument, or seems to be on the
No,
face of it.
I don't buy it. I'm sorry.
Well,
I don't.
Take
Just-
seriously what he said.
No, I never take
If you-
seriously anything Trump says. Sorry.
I think that's a serious mistake.
I know you do, and
It's
I
the fact that
totally
people did
disagree
take
with
seriously what he said that made him president. And
Unfortunately, yes. Not that I would have wanted Hillary,
but Karen, I don't think you're paying attention to what he's actually saying here.
I watch
Federal
what he's doing.
Federal funds would be withheld from a university that follows the sort of destruction of the free speech rights of BDS.
But did he specifically refer to BDS in any way?
No.
All right. Okay.
Doesn't mean it's excluded.
So here again, we'll have to define freedom of speech, and that gets really technical. Yes.
legislation is upcoming in the House. Today, I believe they had a vote on whether or not certain activities would be considered anti-Semitic, such as our new representative Omar
Exactly.
speaking out
Exactly.
against the Israeli regime, not Jews.
Yes. No, it's, as I say, there are wheels within wheels here that we should be paying attention to. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group. Recorded in the studios of Urbana Public Television on March 5th in the 10th week of 2019. Another week in which everyone sees the most extensive global terrorism is U.S. worldwide war-making, for which its principal criminal associates these days are the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Israel. The Israeli government has murdered protesters at Defense with Gaza, the world's largest open-air prison camp. The U.S. supports that, primarily because Israel is the U.S. stationary aircraft carrier for the U.S. control of Mideast energy, gas, and oil, a weapon against U.S. economic rivals from Venezuela to China. Such outrages cannot be dismissed as something that only happens in the South. In the Illinois legislature, our local representative, Carol Ammons, voted to use university funds to support Israeli apartheid, something Ammons would never have done for South African apartheid. On this show, we concentrate on the shamefully underreported news of U.S. war-making. Thanks to our guests today, Karen Aram, Sherry Daly, and David Green. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Crofton Coleman. Thanks to whom this program and others like it will be available on YouTube and archive.org. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Assange, Manning, Snowden, and others were truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government, and particularly by our liberal senators in the state of Illinois. This is Carl Estabrook for the members and friends of AWARE, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, saying in the words of the late broadcaster Edward R. Murrow, good night and good luck.